Okay, hello, welcome to Module 7. This week we're talking about Active Directory. Before we get started on Active Directory, we're going ahead and we're going to log in a little bit differently this time. So normally we're going to be logged in under our Server 2019 GUI. What we actually need to do is we need to log in as administrator. So down in the bottom left-hand corner, you should have the option to switch from Server 2019 to administrator. Administrator might be on the bottom, but go ahead and click on that and click sign in. The reason that we're doing this is because we're installing Active Directory onto our server, and it does need to be installed from the administrator account. Not to mention, we also have to make sure that our administrator account has a solid password on it. And as of right now, it does not have a password at all. As you just saw when I signed in, it just didn't have a password. So first things first, let's go ahead and remedy that situation. There's a couple different ways that you can save or change a password on a user account. Quickest and easiest is just to hit the Control-Alt-Delete and change our password. Old password is blank. And our new password, we're going to go ahead and use the complex CNT password, which is a capital C, NTP, @ SSWORD. So you can see that, capital C, NTP, @ SSWORD. So we'll type it in a second time. And changed our password. So now we don't have to worry about that. Some other things that we want to do before we install Active Directory is just check to make sure that we have everything right from our last lab. So we're going to come down here to our Windows icon, right click on that, click on System, and inside System, we're going to scroll down to System Info, and we're going to click on Change Settings, and we're going to click on More. And first thing we're going to look at is make sure that our computer name is something that is recognizable, which it should be Server 2019, and it is, so that's good. We'll click on More again, and we want to just make sure that our primary DNS suffix of the computer is our last name followed by .com, which it is. We also want to make sure that we check the checkmark box, which it should already be checked, to change the primary DNS suffix when the domain membership changes. So if everything's good like it is on mine, you can just cancel out of this. Realistically, we didn't have to go as far as we did. We could have just come to this point and looked and seen that our computer name was right and our full computer name had our DNS suffix. But I just want to make sure that you guys go through all the steps to see everything. Next thing we're going to do is come to our network settings. So we'll right click on our network icon and open network and internet settings. We'll click on change adapter options. We'll right click on our Ethernet adapter and click properties. Click on TCP/IPv4 and click properties. And again, we just want to make sure that our IP address is a static IP address. In my case, the 192.168.80.10. Our subnet's good, and our preferred DNS server is either this here, which is our loopback address, 127.0.0.1, or just the exact same as our static IP address, which is, in my case, 192.168.80.10. So either one of these, whether it's the loopback or the preferred static DNS or static IP, has to be your preferred DNS server. So make sure that that's right and close through all of this. One last thing that we're going to do before we install Active Directory, probably one of the most important things in my opinion, is we're going to make sure that this thing is got its firewalls off. And we're good. One other thing that you really should do, but we're not going to do because it's going to take a long time, is make sure that this computer is fully updated. Now we can't do that right now because we're not on a public network. We can't go to the internet to get the updates. But if we were, we'd want to make sure that this server was updated completely, because realistically, once it's a domain controller, you don't want to have to deal with anything, right? So let's go ahead and open up Server Manager. And we'll click on Manage. And we're going to click on Add New Roles and Features. We'll click Next through this. This is role-based, so we'll click Next. We are doing this on our server, not from a virtual server or anything like that, so we'll click Next. And we're going to install Active Directory Domain Services. Make sure that it's Domain Services that you click on and not one of the other Active Directory features or roles. Go ahead and click on the Add Features aspect there. Verify again that it's Active Directory Domain Services. You don't want any of these other ones right now. We're going to click Next. Check and make sure that Group Policy Management is checked. It should be by default, but just make sure that it's checked, and then click Next. Click Next through, and click Install. Now, while this is installing, it might take a little bit of time, so we'll skip past, but there is another part to this. We're not done after the install. We do have to promote the the Active Directory server to a domain controller. So it will tell you inside the wizard, but I'm gonna show you another way of doing it as well, just to make sure that you know both ways of promoting the computer to a domain controller, because it's really important. So mine didn't take very long at all. You can see here that it says configuration is required, but that the installation is successful. You should be clicking on the blue area where it says promote this server to a domain controller, but we're not going to do that right now. We're just going to go ahead and click close. Sometimes, you know, when you're working in the IT environment, you will skip past things because you're used to clicking close there. It didn't used to be that you would have to click promote there. You'd usually had to do a DC promo in the command prompt, but they changed that up with newer versions of the Windows Server environment. So now, if you did click past all of that, you have this yellow arrow here with the exclamation point in it that you can click on, which will bring up where you can actually promote the server. So we have our Active Directory Domain Server Service Configuration Wizard. We have 3 different ways that we can promote this to a domain controller. If we were adding a domain controller to an existing domain or adding a new domain to an existing forest, we would check on those. But because this is a brand new server with a brand new domain controller for our network, it's also a brand new forest. We're going to click on this last option. Then we're going to put in our domain name, which is our last name, followed by .com. Type that in, click next. This area here is only important if you're dealing with a pre-existing domain or forest. If for some reason you have multiple domain controllers in the same forest or the same domain, you have to function at the level of the oldest domain controller. So for instance, let's say we built our network in 2008 and our first domain controller was a Windows Server 2008 server. We would want to change these to Windows Server 2008. However, this is a brand new network with a brand new server, so we want to leave them at the functionality level of 2016. Now, what is this functionality level and why does it matter? Basically, it's a list of services and roles and features that Active Directory has with it, options that Active Directory has that allows Active Directory to do the authentication, authorization, and policy control that it does. 2008 doesn't have all the same features and bells and whistles that 2016 has. So if you are running a pre-existing network with a 2008 server that's on a domain controller, you have to function at the lowest level. Now, if you have multiple servers in a network and one of them's a 2008 server, but it's not a domain controller, then that doesn't matter. That doesn't count in this scenario. This is only relevant for domain controllers. So again, we're leaving this at 2016. This is our first domain controller in our first forest. So we're going to make sure that these are checked. We don't need a read-only domain controller, so we're not checking that. And then we're just putting in our DSRM password. This is our directory service restore mode password. You'll never likely use this. But if you do, it'll be 20 years after you've created the password. So make sure that the password that you type in is something that you know, or if it's something that you're going to type in and write down and throw inside of a fireproof safe, that's fine too, but make sure you know where that password is. So we're just going to put in our complex password, C or capital C, NT, P, @. So make sure we type in our capital C, NT, P, @SSWRD password, and then we confirm it and click next. So we can't create a DNS delegation because we don't have an authoritative parent zone because we're not connected to the internet. So make sure that you check off of the create DNS delegation if it's already checked and click next. The NetBIOS domain name will auto-populate here in a second, so just give it a little bit of time, and when it does auto-populate, it should tell you that you can go ahead and click next. If for some reason it doesn't auto-populate to what you want it to be, you can try and fix that, but it should auto-populate. You shouldn't actually have to change this. So click next. And this is where all of our different database folders and log folders and so on are stored. You can change this, but realistically, you don't want to unless you're told to or you've got a good reason. For instance, if your log files are all stored on a specific computer on your network, you might want to change the path for the log files. But other than that, leave all of this alone and click next. This allows you to create a script for creating the Active Directory domain controller, which we're not going to do, so we'll click next. And now it's going to verify that we have all of the prerequisites necessary to create an Active Directory domain controller. And it says that it does. It does have a couple notifications here that you might want to take a look at if you were doing this in a real world environment. But because this is a test environment, these are not really all that important. So we'll go ahead and click install. And again, this process might take a couple of minutes. So we'll let this do this, and we'll see you as soon as it's done. Now that it's done installing and promoting to a domain controller, it's going to reboot on its own, and it's going to take a little while for it to reboot, which isn't a big deal. But as soon as you come back to your login, you'll see that things have changed a little bit to where now you're logging into the domain controller or the domain itself with the your last name /administrator. So your local administrator account is now your domain administrator account. So we can go log in with our complex password, capital C, NT, P, @SSWRD. And we're logged into our domain controller. We can close our server manager. We don't need that. And now let's just take a look at that domain controller's settings a little bit. We're going to click on our Windows icon and go to Windows Administrative Tools. And we're just going to come down here to Active Directory, Users, and Computers. And this is where a good majority, at least, of your Active Directory configuration is going to take place. You can expand your server, which should be your last name. You can expand on computers. Click on computers. You can see that there's no items in here right now because we haven't joined any computers to this domain controller. The reason that this computer is not added in here is because our domain controller is a domain controller, not a computer, and it's in its own organizational unit for domain controllers. But we can see our server here, and we can also expand our users box, click on it, and we can see all of the available users that are existent. You can see down here the user that we created before, which was our server 2019 GUI server user. It still exists, but instead of being an administrator, it's just notified as a user. Now, if you right click on it and go to properties, it should be in the administrators group. You can click on member of, and yep, there it is, administrators. But it's not listed as a administrator built-in account like the administrator account up here is. And actually, we can go ahead and delete this user right now because we don't need it to exist. So we right click on it and just click delete. So now the only administrator account that we have is our administrator account. One other thing that I want to take a look at before we're done with this lab, I want us to go ahead and look at our DNS records. So we're going to type in DNS and open that up. And this is our server 2019. If we expand our forward lookup zones, you can see that we have our kid.com or our lastname.com, but now we also have a bunch of new information here, our underscore MSDCS, our underscore sites, and so on and so forth that we didn't have before. Before, there was a lot less going on here. But because we've upgraded to a domain server, we now have this extra information. So before we finish, one last thing that we want to do is we want to join our client to the server. So we can leave our server the way it is. We can come over here to our Windows 10 client and power it on. And once we power it on, we can go ahead and log into it as the administrator. Now notice that we logged in with our name as opposed to actual administrator. This account is an administrator, and on our Windows 10 box, our administrator account is disabled by default. So we haven't done anything to that to activate it. So before we can join the domain, let's go ahead and look at our network settings again. First things first, let's right click and click on system. And we're going to scroll down here to our rename this PC advanced. And we're going to click on change. Now, right now our computer name is desktop whatever. We should change this before we add this computer to the domain so that we know what it is that is connecting to the domain. You don't want to just have random desktop IDs, because if you're in an actual environment like a business environment, you don't have any way of validating who this is as far as their computer is concerned. So for this case, what we're going to do is we're going to call this, let's just call it sales manager. Now notice that we didn't give it our last name. The worst thing you can do in an Active Directory environment is identify someone by their name as opposed to their position, or a computer by a user's name as opposed to its usability or functionality. So we're naming this sales manager instead of Bob because if we fire Bob tomorrow, we don't want to have to rename this computer. So sales manager works. We'll hit OK. This wants us to reboot because we've renamed our computer, which is fine. We'll go ahead and reboot. And then when it comes back up, we'll log back in and take a look at a couple more things before we actually join this to the domain. Go ahead and log back in. And we know that we changed our host name, but we're just going to go ahead and validate that it has been changed once we're able to by going into our command prompt and typing in host name, one word. There we go, sales manager, we're good to go. So let's take a look at our network settings by right-clicking on our network icon, opening our network and internet settings, coming down here to change adapter options. We're going to right-click on our network adapter and click on properties, and we'll click on TCP/IP and hit properties. And we just want to make sure that we do have our static IP address and that our preferred DNS server, and this is very important, our preferred DNS server has to be the IP address of the domain controller, which it is. But if this doesn't say our IP address of our domain controller, we need to change this. Otherwise, you'll never connect to the domain. So we can hit OK, close out of this, close out of all of this. And now we can join this to the domain, which is actually relatively simple. We're just going to right click on our icon again, our Windows icon. And we're going to click on System. Scroll back down to rename this PC Advanced, click on Change. And now we're going to click on the domain bubble and join our domain, which should be our lastname.com. We'll click OK. And we need to put in the credentials of the administrator of the domain controller. So we'll type in administrator. And we'll type in that complex password, capital CNT, P, @SSWRD. And if you did everything right, this little box should pop up. Welcome to the last name domain. Click OK. It'll tell you have to reboot, which is fine. We'll close out, click restart, and we'll let it restart. Restart anyways, whatever. And as soon as we're able to log back in, because we're logging into the domain controller, or sorry, the domain now, we have to use a user account that is part of the domain. And the only user account that we have that's part of the domain right now is our administrator. So we'll click on control and we're going to log in as a different user. When we click on login as a different user, you'll see this sign into, and then it'll give you your domain name, which is what we're signing into. And we'll type in administrator. Notice how it changes to the name of the computer, sales manager. What we actually want here is we want to put in our last name, backslash, and then our administrator, or sorry, not backslash, // and administrator. So now we're actually logging into the domain as the administrator. We can type in our password now, capital CNT, P, @SSWRD. And it says that it is incorrect. A-D-M-I-N-I-S-T-R-A-T-R. That's right. Maybe it is a backslash instead of a forward slash. There we go. It is a backslash. My bad. I always get that mixed up. And now, even though we're on the Windows 10 computer, we're logging in with the server's domain administrator account, which is going to take a couple minutes because it's the first time we've ever logged into this computer as the domain administrator. While this is doing this, we can come back over here to the server and we can come over to our Active Directory users and computers, and we can see a couple of things. First of all, if we click on computers and we right click and click refresh, now we have our sales manager computer inside the computers area. If we click on users, we still only have our administrator user. We don't have the local user that we had before. And if we click on our forward lookup zone and we refresh this, we can also see here that we have our sales manager computer listed as a forward lookup zone A record because it joined the domain. Notice that we still have the desktop N4L4LDG host as well. That's going to stay in there because it was already registered as the DNS, unless we do something to get rid of it, which would be to scavenge the records, which we'll talk about some other time. But if we scavenge the records, it will look and see if there is duplicates like there is and look to find out which one's correct and get rid of the old ones. But now we have our Windows 10 client, which is connected to the server through the domain, and we're good to go. So that's it for this specific lab. It was pretty quick. It was pretty easy. Next lab, lab 8, we will actually create some objects and such like new users and stuff inside Active Directory so that you can log in as a different user other than administrator. But for now, we're good to go, and we will see you for the next lab. Have a great day.